Hey guys, everything you think you know about geishas is wrong. Picture this: a woman spending decades mastering shamisen, dance, poetry, then being told she can never marry the man she loves because it would destroy her career, not because society forbids it, but because the mathematics of her life make it impossible. Tonight, we're stepping into Edo, Japan, where love existed in the shadows and romance could bankrupt you. The real story is far more complex than any movie ever showed you. Before we begin, take a deep breath, get comfortable wherever you are, maybe dim the lights. This is a story worth settling in for. If you enjoy these late-night journeys through history, hit subscribe, it helps more than you know, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing you're out there, somewhere in the world, sharing this moment with me. Ready? Let's step back in time together. Chapter 1. Disrupting the geisha stereotype. The woman kneeling in the tea house isn't what you think she is. Her white painted face, her silk kimono worth more than most people's houses. She's not a courtesan. She's not selling romance to the highest bidder. She's an artist. And those strict codes governing every aspect of her life, they don't just discourage marriage to her wealthy patrons, they make it financially devastating, professionally ruinous, sometimes impossible. Let's start with what a geisha actually was. Picture a 5-year-old girl sold to an okiya, a geisha house. Not sold into prostitution, sold into decades of training. Shamisen lessons, dance, tea ceremony, poetry, mathematics, the art of conversation. By the time she debuts, she owes the house a fortune. Every lesson, every silk thread, every grain of rice meticulously recorded in ledgers. Her debt will follow her for years, maybe decades. The floating world, the ukiyo, where geishas worked, wasn't about love, it was about escape. Wealthy merchants, forbidden from displays of luxury by samurai law, could enter these pleasure districts and pretend to be aristocrats for a night. They paid for entertainment, conversation, the privilege of watching a master artist perform. And yes, sometimes more, but this wasn't romance. This was transaction, carefully negotiated, clearly understood by all parties involved. Then there was the danna system. Think of it as sophisticated patronage. A wealthy man becomes a geisha's benefactor. He pays her debts, supports her career, receives exclusive access to her company. Intimate relationship, yes, but not marriage, never marriage, because marriage would end everything she'd worked for, her artistic identity, her community, her livelihood. The moment she married, she ceased being a geisha. The moment she ceased being a geisha, she became nobody. But here's what the movies never show you. Love happened anyway. Real love, messy, complicated, impossible love. In 1911, a Kyoto geisha named Ichimaru fell for a university student, someone who could never afford to be her danna. Their secret letters, discovered decades later, revealed desperate plans to run away together. Plans for a life of poverty but genuine affection. She never left. The mathematics of survival wouldn't allow it. Consider the cruel arithmetic of a geisha's life. Training cost thousands. Kimonos cost more than houses. If she married before her debts were paid, the okiya demanded immediate settlement. Most couldn't afford it, so they chose financial security over love. Not because they were materialistic, because they were pragmatic, because love doesn't pay for food or shelter or medical care when you're 45 years old with no other skills. Some relationships with danna did involve genuine affection. Letters from the 1890s between the geisha Kiharu and her benefactor show real tenderness. Pet names, worry about each other's health. When his wife died, he suggested marriage. She declined. Not because she didn't care, because at 43, finally debt-free, marriage meant trading luxury for poverty. She'd earned her independence. Why give it away for sentiment? The distinction between geishas and oiran, high-ranking courtesans, matters here. An oiran could be ransomed through mizuage, her virginity sold with possibility of marriage afterward. Geishas chose their own sexual partners, maintained autonomy over their bodies. This independence came with a price. While an oiran might escape through marriage, a geisha's very identity was her career. Marriage meant ceasing to exist as herself. Picture Masuda Sayo's memoir, watching her peers choose wealthy danna over poor lovers repeatedly. Not out of greed, out of survival instinct. These women had no safety net except what they built themselves. No family to return to, they'd been sold away as children. No husband legally obligated to support them. Just their artistry, their reputation, their carefully cultivated relationships with men who could afford their company. The Geisha world achieved something remarkable for Japanese women. Property ownership, the right to refuse clients, wealth accumulation, business management. These freedoms were almost unimaginable for conventional wives, bound to their husbands' families, subject to mothers-in-law, economically powerless. But freedom came with isolation from traditional romantic structures. Professional success required sacrificing the possibility of conventional love. The price of independence was loneliness. When love bloomed in this world, it bloomed in margins. Secret glances during shamisen performances, letters hidden in kimono sleeves, meetings in moonlit gardens after official entertainments ended. These moments were treasured precisely because they couldn't be possessed, because they existed outside the economic structures governing everything else. Pure emotion in a world of careful calculation. Dangerous, beautiful, usually impossible to sustain. The Western imagination created myths about geisha romance that bear no resemblance to reality. These weren't tragic figures waiting for rescue by love. They were working women navigating brutal economic systems with intelligence and grace. When genuine affection appeared, and it did appear, they often recognized it couldn't coexist with the life they'd built. Some forms of love exist best when they don't demand total transformation. Their influence on Japanese aesthetics runs deep. The concept of iki, sophisticated restraint, the beauty of transience, the understanding that some things are precious precisely because they cannot last. Geisha culture taught that genuine elegance comes from what you don't do, don't say, don't demand, from appreciating moments without trying to possess them, from finding beauty in limitation rather than fighting against it. So the next time you see a geisha in popular culture, remember this. She understood exactly what she was trading. Love wasn't worth the price of poverty. Professional identity mattered more than romantic convention. In her world, genuine affection existed in shadows, treasured because it couldn't be possessed. Perhaps there's wisdom in that. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider how much we still grapple with these same impossible choices. Chapter 2. Walking through Geisha history. Picture Edo-period Japan, somewhere around 1650. Snow falls silently on wooden streets. Behind sliding doors, a young girl practices shamisen until her fingers bleed. She's 7 years old, sold to an okiya 3 months ago. Her real name doesn't matter anymore. She'll earn a new one when she debuts. This is where our story begins. In a world where love was luxury, few could afford. The floating world, that's what they called the pleasure districts of old Japan. Yoshiwara in Edo, Gion in Kyoto, places where normal rules bent like bamboo in wind. Here, women could own property, refuse clients, build wealth, but freedom came with chains you couldn't see. Every lesson cost money, every silk kimono, every grain of rice. The debt accumulated like snow on a roof, heavy, persistent, threatening to collapse everything beneath. Training began before dawn, dance until breakfast, shamisen until lunch, tea ceremony in the afternoon. Poetry, calligraphy, conversation. These girls weren't just learning entertainment. They were becoming living art. By age 15, a successful geisha could recite classical literature, perform complex dances, and navigate political conversations that would challenge university professors. But mastery took decades, and decades cost fortunes most families couldn't imagine. The math was brutal. A single silk obi could cost what a farmer earned in 2 years. Wooden getter sandals, hand-painted, makeup brushes made from badger hair. Every detail of a geisha's appearance represented someone's labor, someone's artistry, someone's bill. The okiya kept meticulous records. This much for training, this much for room and board. Interest accumulated daily. Some geishas worked 20 years before seeing their first profit. Enter the danna, the patron. Usually a wealthy merchant or politician who could afford to support a geisha exclusively. He paid her debts, bought her kimonos, provided a monthly allowance. In return, she belonged to him, not as property, but as companion. She attended his parties, entertained his business associates, shared his bed. It wasn't marriage, it was something more complex, a business arrangement dressed in silk and poetry. Marriage meant death. Professional death, anyway. The moment a geisha married, she ceased to exist in the karyukai. No more performances, no more income, no more identity. Her kimono would be folded away forever. If her debts weren't settled, the okiya could demand immediate payment. Most couldn't afford it, so marriage became a luxury only successful geishas nearing retirement could consider. Love was expensive in ways most people never calculated. Spring of 1911. A Kyoto geisha named Ikimaru falls in love with a university student. He writes poetry, she writes back. They meet secretly in temple gardens, sharing rice cakes and impossible dreams. He earns nothing, she earns everything, but owns none of it. Their letters, discovered decades later, map out desperate plans to run away together. She never did. The numbers wouldn't add up. Love couldn't pay debts. The choice wasn't between money and love, it was between survival and sentiment. Geishas who chose poorly ended up destitute, their training worthless outside the floating world. No respectable family would accept an ex-geisha as a daughter-in-law. No business would hire a woman whose only skills were shamisen and conversation, so they chose security over romance, duty over desire. Not from coldness, but from practicality, that would break your heart. But affection bloomed anyway, quietly, carefully, in the margins of arranged relationships. Letters between Geisha Kiharu and her danna from the 1890s revealed genuine tenderness. Pet names, inside jokes, real concern when the other fell ill. He called her his autumn moon, she called him her steady mountain. When his wife died and he proposed marriage, she declined. At 43, poverty felt scarier than loneliness. People confuse geishas with oiran, but the difference mattered enormously. Oiran were courtesans who could be ransomed through marriage. Their virginity was sold to the highest bidder with the promise of eventual freedom. Geishas chose their own lovers, maintained control over their bodies. This independence came with a price. While an oiran might escape through marriage, a geisha's very soul was her profession. To marry meant to disappear. Some relationships lasted decades. Masayo served the same danna for 37 years, through his marriage, his children's births, his business failures and recoveries. She knew his fears better than his wife did. When he died in 1923, he left her enough money to finally buy her freedom. She was 62, too old for love, too old for new dreams. She kept his letters in a lacquered box until her own death. The sacrifice was always unequal. He had a wife at home, children who would inherit his name. She had a profession that consumed her entirely. Her children, if any, carried no surname. Her old age depended on careful savings and the kindness of younger geishas, yet many chose this life over conventional marriage, because here, at least, their intelligence mattered, their opinions were sought, their company valued beyond their ability to produce heirs. Love in the floating world looked different. Quieter, more patient. It bloomed in stolen glances during tea ceremonies, in poems hidden inside sleeve linings, in the way a danna's voice softened when speaking her name. These relationships couldn't demand total transformation from either party. Perhaps that's why they endured. Love that doesn't insist on possession sometimes proves more durable than the kind that does. The Geisha system revealed something profound about women and independence. These women achieved rare autonomy. They could refuse clients, own property, build wealth. But this freedom required sacrificing conventional family structures. The tension between professional success and traditional love, it's a struggle that echoes through centuries. Reaching even into today, some choices remain as difficult now as they were in 1850. Their influence spread far beyond pleasure districts. The concept of iki, sophisticated restraint, came partly from geisha aesthetics. The beauty of transience, of things that bloom and fade, Japanese literature, theatre, even modern fashion carry traces of their world. They shaped how we think about elegance, about the space between saying everything and saying nothing. Their silence spoke volumes about desire and discipline. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember this. Geishas weren't tragic figures waiting for rescue. They were professionals who understood exactly what they traded. In their world, genuine affection existed in shadows, treasured precisely because it couldn't be possessed. Their hearts were caught between duty, survival, and genuine love, a tug of war that perhaps never truly ends. Some battles are won by not choosing sides. Chapter 3. Understanding the Geisha, Society Interaction. Picture Japan in the 1600s, a world built on rigid hierarchies where every person knew their exact place in society. Women especially lived within carefully drawn boundaries. Daughter, wife, mother, but in the floating pleasure districts of Edo, something extraordinary existed. A space where women could step outside these traditional roles entirely, not as rebels, but as artists. Professional entertainers who belonged to neither the domestic sphere nor the demimonde. The term floating world wasn't just poetic language, it described a philosophy, a temporary escape from the weight of Confucian duty and social obligation. In this world, time moved differently. Beauty was fleeting, pleasure was art, and geishas were the architects of these ephemeral moments. They weren't wives bound to single households. They weren't courtesans selling intimacy. They were something entirely new, professional companions who mastered the delicate art of making powerful men feel interesting. To understand their unique position, you have to grasp how suffocating life was for most women then. A daughter lived under her father's authority until marriage, then transferred like property to her husband's family. Her worth measured entirely by her ability to produce sons and manage household affairs. Education beyond basic literacy was considered dangerous, yet Geishas moved freely through the city, owned property, refused clients they disliked, and accumulated wealth in their own names. This freedom came at a steep price, though. Most geishas entered the profession as children, sold by desperate families to okiyas, geisha houses that functioned like expensive boarding schools, crossed with business enterprises. These girls, some as young as 5, would spend the next decade learning arts that took a lifetime to master: shamisen music, classical dance, tea ceremony, flower arrangement. But perhaps most importantly, the subtle art of conversation with men who held the fate of nations in their hands. The hierarchy within geisha society was as complex as any feudal court. At the bottom were the hangyoku, young apprentices, who cleaned, served tea, and observed everything with careful eyes. Above them, the junior geishas who had learned basic skills but hadn't yet developed their signature artistic specialties. At the pinnacle sat the senior geishas, women whose reputations could make or break political alliances. These women wielded soft power that wives confined to domestic spheres could never access. What's fascinating is how geishas navigated the contradiction of their existence. They were sophisticated enough to debate literature with scholars, yet legally they remained bound to their okiyas through debt that could take decades to repay. Every silk kimono, every music lesson, every grain of rice was meticulously recorded. They earned money entertaining clients, but most went straight to paying off these accumulated expenses. Financial independence was always just beyond reach, like a horizon that moved as you approached it. The men who frequented geisha houses weren't just seeking entertainment, they were escaping their own rigid social roles. A merchant bound by Confucian hierarchy to bow to samurai could find himself treated with genuine respect by a geisha who cared more about his conversation than his birth rank. Politicians exhausted by formal court protocols could relax into authentic discussions about poetry or current events. These spaces functioned as unofficial salons, where real business got conducted between the seiki and shamisen music, but geishas walked a constant tightrope between intimacy and distance. They had to make each client feel special while never becoming too attached to any single person. Their training included not just artistic skills but emotional management techniques that would impress modern therapists. They learned to read micro-expressions, deflect unwanted advances gracefully, and maintain conversation even when topics turned tedious. This emotional labor was perhaps their most valuable skill, though it rarely appeared in the account books. The distinction between geishas and courtesans confused many outsiders then, and still does today. Courtesans sold sexual services as their primary offering. Geishas sold companionship, conversation, and artistic entertainment. Yes, intimate relationships sometimes developed, but these were personal choices, not professional requirements. A geisha could refuse physical intimacy without losing her reputation. In fact, maintaining some mystery about her private feelings often enhanced her appeal. Distance created desire in ways that availability could not. During the Meiji Restoration, when Japan opened to Western influence, geisha society faced unprecedented challenges. Suddenly, Western-style ballrooms competed with traditional tea houses. European dress challenged the elegant kimono, piano music vied with the shamisen. Some predicted the end of geisha culture entirely. Instead, many geishas adapted brilliantly, learning Western languages and customs while maintaining their traditional arts. They became cultural bridges between old Japan and the emerging modern nation. The social dynamics within tea houses resembled elaborate theatre productions where everyone understood their roles perfectly. Senior geishas entered rooms with presence that could silence conversations. Junior geishas deferred gracefully while watching every interaction for lessons in human psychology. Clients performed versions of themselves, more charming, more important, more interesting than their daily selves. These weren't deceptions but collaborative fantasies that everyone participated in creating. Magic built from mutual agreement to suspend ordinary social rules. What outsiders rarely understood was how much intellectual stimulation these interactions provided. Geishas read voraciously to keep up with current events, literature, and philosophical debates. A successful geisha could discuss everything from rice futures to recent poetry publications with equal fluency. They were walking libraries of cultural knowledge, able to make obscure literary references or explain complex political situations with elegant simplicity. Their minds were as carefully cultivated as their artistic skills. The seasonal rhythms of geisha life reflected Japan's deep connection to natural cycles. Spring brought cherry blossom parties where geishas wore their most delicate kimonos and performed dances celebrating renewal. Summer meant intimate evening gatherings on platforms over rivers, where the sound of water mixed with shamisen strings. Autumn featured moon-viewing ceremonies with poetry competitions. Winter brought New Year preparations, the most important celebrations of the geisha calendar. Each season demanded different repertoires, different emotional tones, different versions of beauty. Perhaps most remarkably, geishas developed their own language of subtle signals and coded communications. A particular way of arranging her obi sash might indicate whether she was available for new clients. The angle of her fan could express interest or polite dismissal. Even her walking style conveyed messages to those who knew how to read them. These women created an entire vocabulary of non-verbal communication that allowed them to maintain control over their interactions while appearing utterly gracious and accommodating. The tragedy and triumph of geisha society was how it created space for female agency within systems designed to eliminate it entirely. These women found ways to accumulate wealth, develop artistic mastery, and exercise choice over their personal relationships despite legal structures that treated them as property. They couldn't vote or inherit family businesses, but they could refuse clients, negotiate their fees, and build reputations that transcended class boundaries. Limited freedom, perhaps, but freedom nonetheless, in a world that offered women precious little. Their legacy extends far beyond the tea houses and entertainment districts. Geishas influenced Japanese aesthetics, popularized artistic styles that persist today, and demonstrated that femininity could be both powerful and profitable. They showed that women could master complex skills, navigate sophisticated social networks, and build independent lives even within patriarchal structures. Their story reminds us that throughout history, some people have always found ways to create beauty and meaning, even within systems designed to limit their possibilities. Tomorrow, we'll explore how love complicated this carefully balanced world. Chapter 4. Inside the Okiya. Picture a wooden house in 1890s Kyoto, its paper screens glowing softly in the morning light. Behind these walls lived something most people never understood. Not a brothel, not a school, something in between. This was an okiya, a geisha house where little girls became living art, where childhood ended at the front door, and a lifetime of discipline began. The smell of incense mixed with hair oil, the sound of shamisen strings being tuned. The girls arrived in different ways. Some parents sold them outright, desperate families trading a daughter for enough money to survive the winter. Others came through arrangements that sounded kinder, but weren't really. A family friend offering opportunity, a better life in the city. The girls rarely understood what was happening. 5 years old, 6 at most, still young enough to believe adults when they promised everything would be wonderful. Inside, the okiya operated like a small business. The okasan, the house mother, calculated every expense with precision that would make a banker proud. Rice, silk, lessons, medical care, everything went into a ledger against the child's name, a debt that would follow her for decades. The wooden floors creaked under tiny feet as girls learned their first lesson. Nothing here was free, everything had a price. The youngest girls started as maids, sweeping floors, preparing baths, helping older geishas dress. Their small hands learned to fold kimono properly, silk worth more than most people earned in a year. They watched everything: how to bow at precisely the right angle, how to pour tea without making a sound, how to disappear into the background until needed. These weren't just chores, they were the foundation of everything that came after. Around age 10, formal training began. Dance lessons that lasted hours. The shamisen, a 3-stringed instrument that seemed simple until you tried to play it. Tea ceremony, where every gesture carried meaning. Calligraphy that had to be perfect, every brushstroke deliberate. The girls practiced until their fingers bled, until muscle memory replaced conscious thought, until art became as natural as breathing. Because imperfection wasn't tolerated here. The hierarchy was absolute. Newest girls served everyone above them. Older apprentices, called shikomi, commanded respect from the newer ones. Above them, the maiko, junior geisha still learning. At the top, full geishas who could make or break a young girl's future with a single word. Each level had its privileges and responsibilities. Each step up the ladder came with new freedoms and new pressures. Meals happened at specific times, in specific ways. The girls knelt on tatami mats, backs straight, eating in silence unless spoken to. Rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, simple food, measured portions. Their bodies were investments, too thin, and they looked unhealthy, too heavy, and they couldn't move gracefully in kimono. Every calorie was considered, every aspect of their physical development, monitored like prize livestock. Sleep came late and started early. After the established geishas returned from their evening appointments, sometimes near dawn, the girls helped them undress, carefully removing layer after layer of silk, cleaning white makeup from faces, storing elaborate hair ornaments. Only then could they rest. 4 hours later, the cycle began again. Training before breakfast, chores between lessons, a schedule that would break most adults. The outside world became a memory. Letters from family were read by the okasan first, if they came at all. Many families simply disappeared. The girls created new bonds within the okiya walls. Sisters by circumstance, not blood, they braided each other's hair, shared whispered secrets, invented games during brief moments of freedom. These relationships often lasted longer than marriages. They understood each other in ways no one else could. Punishment was swift and thorough. A poorly executed dance move meant practicing until perfect. Clumsy service during tea ceremony earned days of extra chores. Speaking out of turn could mean isolation, no dramatic beatings that would damage valuable property. Instead, a systematic breaking down of will through exhaustion and shame. The message was clear: conform or suffer. Most learned to conform quickly. By adolescence, the successful girls began to change. Their voices became softer, more controlled. Their movements flowed like water. They learned to read faces, anticipate needs, become whatever their audience required. Shy with some clients, witty with others, mysterious or approachable as the situation demanded. They became masters of emotional shape-shifting. It was survival. It was also a kind of artistry that few could appreciate. Not everyone survived the training. Some girls ran away, though they rarely got far. Others simply broke. The pressure, the isolation, the constant performance wore them down until nothing remained. A few lucky ones were sent home when it became clear they'd never adapt. But most stayed, because by then this strange world was the only one they knew. The outside had become foreign territory. The successful ones began earning money around 16. First as maiko, junior companions who attended parties with senior geishas. They learned conversation, drinking games, how to laugh at jokes they'd heard 1,000 times, how to make middle-aged men feel charming and clever. The money went to the okiya, of course, against their debt, but it was the first taste of their economic value. Their first glimpse of potential freedom. The transformation was remarkable. These children who'd arrived scared and confused became polished performers. Every gesture calculated, every word chosen. They could discuss poetry, politics, business with equal grace. They knew which clients preferred traditional songs versus modern ones, which wanted intellectual conversation versus simple flattery. They'd become human chameleons, shaped entirely by this closed world behind paper screens. The okiya was family, prison, and business all at once. The girls who succeeded there developed bonds that lasted lifetimes. They'd shared something impossible to explain to outsiders. They'd survived a system that demanded everything: childhood, freedom, individual identity, in exchange for a chance at eventual independence. Some thrived, others endured. All were changed forever by those early years behind wooden walls. Understanding the okiya helps explain everything that came after. Why geishas seemed so mysterious, so controlled. They'd learnt to survive by becoming perfect mirrors, reflecting what others wanted to see. The discipline, the artistry, the emotional armor, it all began here. In these houses where children learned that love was a luxury they couldn't afford, where art became both salvation and cage, where little girls disappeared and something else entirely emerged. Chapter 5. The Price to Pay. Exploring the geisha debts. Picture a ledger book, its pages yellowed with age, filled with careful brushstrokes recording every debt. Each silk kimono, 15 yen. Shamisen lessons, 3 yen monthly. Rice, tea, makeup, all meticulously tracked. This wasn't just bookkeeping, this was a young woman's entire future, written in ink that would bind her for decades. The okiya mothers kept these records like sacred texts, because in the floating world, nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever free. When a girl entered an okiya at 5 or 6 years old, she became an investment. Every grain of rice she ate, every lesson she received, every thread of silk that touched her skin, it all went into the debt column. The okiya mothers weren't cruel, exactly. They were businesswomen running expensive operations. Training a geisha cost what a farmer might earn in 5 years. By the time a girl made her debut as a maiko, she owed more money than most people saw in a lifetime. The mathematics were brutal but simple. A single formal kimono could cost 30 yen when a laborer earned 50 yen per year. Multiply that by dozens of seasonal outfits. Add years of music and dance instruction, daily meals, housing. The debt grew like compound interest. Most geishas worked for decades before seeing their first profit. Some never escaped debt at all, dying still owing money to the houses that raised them. This wasn't slavery, but it wasn't freedom either. Here's what changed everything. Marriage. The moment a geisha married, her career ended. Not reduced, not modified, completely finished. She had to abandon her name, her training, her entire identity. More devastating still, any remaining debt became immediately due. The okiya wouldn't wait for gradual payment anymore. They demanded full settlement before she could leave. For most geishas, this made marriage financially impossible, regardless of love. The choice was stark. Career or romance, never both. The danna system offered a different path, one that kept geishas working while providing financial security. A wealthy patron would agree to pay her debts and living expenses in exchange for exclusive companionship. This wasn't marriage, it was a business arrangement. Both parties understood completely. He got sophisticated company and intimate access. She got debt relief and protection, but she remained a geisha, maintaining her professional identity while navigating this complex personal relationship. Some danna relationships lasted decades, involving genuine affection and mutual respect. Letters from the 1890s between the geisha Kaharu and her patron reveal pet names, inside jokes, concern for each other's health. They shared children, holidays, quiet domestic moments, yet when he suggested marriage after his wife's death, she declined. At 43, finally debt-free, marriage would have meant poverty after a lifetime of luxury. Love existed, but it couldn't demand total sacrifice. The cruelest situations involved geishas who fell for men who couldn't afford to be their danna. In 1911, Ikimaru, a renowned Kyoto geisha, exchanged secret letters with a university student. Their correspondence, discovered decades later, reveals desperate plans to run away together. She calculated the costs, her unpaid debt, the okiya's fury, a life in hiding. The numbers never worked. She stayed. He married someone else. The ledger always won. Understanding the debt system means understanding how thoroughly it shaped every decision. A geisha couldn't simply quit and become a housewife. The okiya held legal claim to her earnings until every yen was repaid. Some houses deliberately kept geishas in debt longer, charging inflated prices for necessities. Others were more fair but still bound by the same economic realities. The most successful geishas developed strategies, negotiating payment plans, choosing wealthy clients, saving obsessively. The hierarchy within okiyas reflected these financial realities perfectly. Senior geishas who'd paid their debts gained freedom and respect. They could refuse clients, take vacations, even help younger women navigate the system. But apprentices and junior geishas lived under constant financial pressure. Every decision, which parties to attend, which clients to favor, which skills to develop, was calculated against their mounting debt. Money shaped everything, even in a world supposedly dedicated to art. Masuda Sayo wrote candidly about watching her peers choose wealthy danna over poor lovers repeatedly. Not from greed, she emphasized, but from survival instinct. Love was luxury they couldn't afford. She described young geishas weeping privately after sending away suitors who offered genuine affection but empty pockets. The floating world demanded sacrifice, and romantic love was often the first casualty. Beauty and talent were commodities. Emotions were complications. The distinction between geishas and courtesans becomes crucial here. Oran could be ransomed through mizuage, their virginity sold with the possibility of marriage afterward. Geishas maintained control over their bodies and chose their own sexual partners. This autonomy came at a price. While an oran might escape through marriage, A geisha's very identity was her career. To marry meant to cease being a geisha, something many found unthinkable after decades of dedication. Consider the psychological weight of this system. These women spent their entire lives perfecting arts that defined them completely. Their names, their kimonos, their knowledge of music and poetry, everything was connected to being a geisha. Marriage didn't just mean leaving a job, it meant abandoning an entire identity, often for men they barely knew. The okiya became their family, other geishas their sisters. Leaving meant exile from the only world they understood. Some found creative solutions within the constraints. Wealthy geishas occasionally paid off younger women's debts, creating unofficial adoption relationships. Others invested their earnings in property or businesses, building financial independence that might someday allow marriage. A few negotiated unusual arrangements with understanding patrons, relationships that looked like marriage but maintained their professional status. These exceptions proved how rigid the normal rules were. The records from Kyoto's Gion district in the 1920s show the stark numbers of 300 active Gion, only 12 married during that decade. All 12 had either paid their debts completely or found patrons willing to settle everything immediately. The others continued working, some into their 60s, their skills and connections more valuable than any husband could provide. They built different kinds of families, different definitions of success. What emerges from these stories isn't tragedy exactly, but complexity. These women understood their choices clearly. They traded conventional romantic structures for artistic autonomy and financial independence, rare privileges for Japanese women of any era. When love appeared, it was often treasured precisely because it couldn't be possessed completely. Some forms of affection exist best when they don't demand total transformation. The Geisha debt system reveals how societies create impossible binds for women seeking independence. These weren't victims waiting for rescue. They were professionals who understood exactly what they were trading. In their world, genuine affection bloomed in the margins, beautiful because it was forbidden. As you drift toward sleep, remember their choice. Sometimes the price of freedom is accepting that love and career exist in different currencies entirely. Chapter 6. Unraveling the Financial Burden. Behind the silk and artistry lay a harsh truth that bound geishas to their okiyas for decades. Every lesson, every meal, every thread of their elaborate kimonos was carefully recorded in ledgers that determined their fate. The beauty of their world came at a price so steep that most spent their entire careers climbing out of debt. Tonight, we follow the money and discover how financial chains shaped every aspect of a geisha's existence. The numbers were staggering. Training a single geisha from childhood cost what a craftsman might earn in 20 years. Dance lessons with master teachers, shamisen instruction, tea ceremony, training. Each skill demanded its own specialized instructor, and none worked for free. Before a girl ever entertained her first client, she owed the equivalent of a small fortune. The okiya kept meticulous records, down to the last sen of every investment made in her future. Picture ledger books filled with careful brushstrokes, each entry documenting another expense. Rice for breakfast, 3 sen. New shamisen strings, 15 sen. Silk for practice. Kimono, 200 sen. The Maiko's wooden sandals, worn thin from walking to lessons, recorded. Her face powder, imported from Kyoto, recorded. Even the oil for her hair ornaments found its way into those relentless columns of debt that grew faster than cherry blossoms in spring. The debt wasn't simple money borrowed. It was a complex web of obligations that touched every moment of their lives. The okiya owned their future earnings, their living space, their very identity as geishas. Room and board, medical care, clothing allowances, everything became another line in the account books. Some girls entered the house at 5 years old, accumulating expenses for over a decade before they could earn a single coin for themselves. 20 years, 30 years, some geishas remained indebted for their entire working lives, earning money that flowed directly back to the okiya like water through a sieve. The most successful might clear their debts in 15 years if they attracted wealthy patrons early, but for every celebrated geisha who achieved financial freedom, 3 others remained bound by numbers in those careful ledgers, their artistic skills generating wealth they'd never truly possess. Even daily necessities carried costs that accumulated like autumn leaves. A bowl of rice, recorded. New tabby socks, recorded. Medicine when she fell ill, recorded with interest. The okiya provided everything a geisha needed to maintain her appearance and health. But nothing came without a price. Every comfort, every necessity became another grain of sand in the hourglass of her financial obligations. measured and weighed against her future earnings. A single formal kimono could cost more than a farmer earned in 3 years. The silk, woven by master craftsmen, the intricate dyeing process that took months, the hand-painted designs that made each garment unique. A successful geisha needed dozens of these elaborate robes, each one carefully catalogued in the okiyas books. The most expensive kimono in one Kyoto house cost 800 yen in 1925, when laborers earned 15 yen monthly. Training expenses extended far beyond lessons. The shamisen itself, crafted from cat skin and precious wood, cost 40 yen. The bone picks to play it, 2 yen each. Dance fans, makeup brushes, hair ornaments, each tool of their trade, carried a price tag that found its way into those endless ledgers. Master teachers commanded premium fees, and the most accomplished geishas studied under legends whose lessons cost more than most people's monthly wages. The okiya functioned as home, school, bank, and prison all at once. These establishments advanced enormous sums for their girls' development, betting on future earnings that might never materialize. Some houses supported 20 geishas and maiko simultaneously, each accumulating different levels of debt. The mama-san who ran each okiya balanced dozens of individual accounts, calculating earnings and expenses with the precision of a merchant handling precious gems. Interest compounded monthly on unpaid balances. Late fees applied when earnings fell short of expenses. Administrative charges covered the bookkeeping itself. The financial mathematics grew increasingly complex as years passed, with old debts generating new obligations like ivy spreading across a garden wall. A geisha might work for months only to see her total debt increase rather than decrease, trapped in a system designed to ensure her continued service. Medical expenses presented particular burdens. When illness prevented work, the bills continued while income stopped. Pregnancy meant months of lost earnings plus childbirth costs. Injuries from dancing or accidents required expensive treatments that pushed debt totals even higher. The okiya provided care, but nothing was free. Even the traditional remedies, ginseng tea for energy, special powders for complexion, each remedy carried its own price and interest rate. Escape seemed impossible for those deeply in debt. Running away meant abandoning years of investment in skills that had no value outside the floating world. Police would return runaways to their okiyas, and the penalties for attempted flight included additional fees and stricter supervision. The debt legally bound them like invisible chains, enforced by social structures that recognized the okiya's financial claims as legitimate business obligations requiring repayment. The most celebrated geishas eventually tasted freedom, watching their final debt payments disappear from those relentless ledgers. These successful women often became independent artists, or opened their own okiyas, finally owning their earnings after decades of servitude. But freedom came late. Most achieved independence only in their 30s or 40s, after their prime earning years had enriched others while they lived as beautifully dressed servants to compound interest. Some never escaped. Archives from closed okiyas reveal geishas who died still owing money, their debts exceeding their lifetime earnings despite decades of work. These women lived their entire adult lives generating wealth they never possessed, their artistic talents feeding a financial machine that consumed their labor while providing comfortable captivity. Their stories remind us that even the most enchanting worlds can hide systems of exploitation. The system persisted because it worked for the okiyas. They provided training, housing, and career management while maintaining guaranteed income streams for decades. Society accepted this arrangement because geishas appeared prosperous and content, their financial struggles hidden behind silk kimonos and perfect makeup. The ledger books told the true story, numbers that revealed how beauty and artistry could become prisons as binding as iron bars. These financial chains shaped every choice geishas made about love, marriage, and independence. The debt system wasn't accidental. It was carefully designed to ensure lifelong service through economic necessity. Understanding these numbers helps us see past the romantic myths, to recognize these women as workers trapped in gilded cages, using their intelligence and artistry to survive systems designed to exploit their talents while keeping them forever in debt. Chapter 7. The danna, a beneficial romance. Picture a world where love and money intertwined in ways that would seem impossible today. In the Geisha districts of old Japan, the most important relationship wasn't marriage. It was something far more complex. The danna, a wealthy patron who could change a geisha's entire life with a single promise. But this wasn't romance as we understand it. This was survival, wrapped in silk and ceremony. The word danna literally means master or husband. But for geishas, it meant something entirely different. This was a man of significant wealth who would pledge to pay off her massive debts. Every lesson she'd taken, every kimono she'd worn, every grain of rice she'd eaten, all of it carefully recorded in the okiyas books. The numbers were staggering. Most geishas owed the equivalent of decades of ordinary wages. In exchange for settling these debts, the danna received something precious, exclusive access to her companionship. Not just for formal tea ceremonies or evening entertainment, but intimate evenings away from the public eye. She would attend only to him during certain hours, accompany him to private dinners, travel with him. Her time, her attention, her body, all became his to claim when he chose. Choosing a danna wasn't random. The most successful geishas had multiple wealthy men competing for the honor. Her okiya would investigate each candidate carefully, examining his fortune, his reputation, his treatment of previous geishas, because once chosen, this relationship could last for years, even decades. The geisha had to be certain she could tolerate his company, his demands, his temperament for the long term. The exclusivity was absolute. While under his patronage, she couldn't accept the intimate companionship of other men. Her evenings belonged to him whenever he desired them. This meant turning away other wealthy clients, limiting her earning potential in exchange for the security he provided. It was a calculated risk, trading multiple income streams for one very generous benefactor who might disappear at any moment. Daily life with a danna followed unspoken rhythms. He might summon her for afternoon tea in a private room, where she'd perform just for him, the shamisen music floating through sliding doors, her voice soft and meant only for his ears. Or perhaps dinner at an exclusive restaurant where she'd sit beside him, pouring his sake, laughing at his stories, providing the kind of sophisticated companionship his wife couldn't offer. The emotional complexity was staggering. Some geishas genuinely grew fond of their danna over time, appreciating his kindness, his generosity, even developing real affection. Others maintained a careful professional distance, treating each encounter like an elaborate performance, but all understood the fundamental truth. This wasn't love in any conventional sense. It was a business arrangement dressed up in beauty and intimacy. Both parties benefited in ways that went beyond money and companionship. The danna gained status in the floating world. Other men envied his access to such an accomplished artist. Meanwhile, the geisha gained financial security and protection. Her debts disappeared, her future became stable, and she could focus on perfecting her arts without the constant pressure of earning enough to survive another month. But here's what's crucial to understand. This was explicitly not marriage. The danna usually had a legal wife at home, a woman chosen by his family for practical reasons. The geisha occupied a completely different space in his life, the realm of pleasure, art, and escape from social obligations. She was his retreat from the formal world, never his partner in it. Sometimes, inevitably, real feelings developed. A danna might find himself genuinely caring for his geisha beyond their arrangement. She might discover she looked forward to his visits for reasons that had nothing to do with financial security. But these emotions remained dangerous, threatening the careful balance that made their relationship possible. Love complicated everything in ways neither could afford to indulge. The business side never disappeared, even in moments of genuine tenderness. Contracts were sometimes drawn up, specifying expectations and duration. The okiya remained involved, taking their percentage and ensuring their valuable asset remained protected. Monthly allowances were discussed, gift-giving protocols established. Romance might bloom, but it bloomed within a framework of commerce that neither party could ignore for long. Historical records tell us about famous pairings that lasted for extraordinary lengths of time. Shimaru of Kyoto maintained her relationship with the same textile merchant for 15 years, accompanying him on business trips, bearing him children, becoming an integral part of his private life, while remaining completely separate from his public one. Their letters, discovered decades later, reveal genuine affection mixed with careful financial planning. From the geisha's perspective, a good danna represented freedom, the chance to pursue her artistry without constantly worrying about money. She could commission the finest kimonos, study with the most respected teachers, host elaborate parties that enhanced her reputation. The relationship, however emotionally complicated, provided the foundation for everything else she hoped to achieve in the floating world. Long-term relationships developed their own rhythms and traditions. A danna might celebrate the anniversary of their first meeting with elaborate gifts, rare silks, precious ornaments, even property in her name. Some built separate houses for their geishas, creating private worlds where conventional social rules didn't apply. These spaces became sanctuaries where both could pretend for a few hours that their arrangement was something more. When relationships ended, as they inevitably did, the transitions were usually handled with careful ceremony. A danna might continue providing financial support, even after their intimate arrangement concluded, ensuring his former geisha's comfort in her later years. Some relationships evolved into genuine friendships, stripped of their romantic elements, but retaining mutual respect and care. Others ended abruptly, leaving the geisha to find new patronage or face uncertain futures. The danna system reveals something profound about human nature. Our ability to find genuine connection, even within purely transactional relationships. These weren't fairy tale romances, but they weren't devoid of real feeling either. They existed in the space between love and business, creating bonds that were neither fully authentic nor completely artificial. Perhaps that's the most honest kind of relationship, one where both parties know exactly what they're trading. Chapter 8: Marriage, an end of an era. Picture this. You've spent 20 years mastering the shamisen, perfecting your dance, learning the subtle art of conversation. You are your craft. Your identity lives in the silk of your kimono, the precision of your tea ceremony. Then love arrives, and suddenly, everything you are must die for everything you could become. For a geisha, marriage wasn't a beginning. It was the most beautiful ending imaginable. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Every grain of rice you'd eaten, every lesson you'd received, every silk thread in every kimono, it was all meticulously recorded in the okiyas ledger books. A geisha's debt could reach astronomical sums. Marriage meant immediate settlement, full payment. Right now, most women earned enough to live comfortably, even luxuriously, but to buy their complete freedom, that required a fortune few possessed. Imagine loving someone who could never afford you, not your affection, but literally the price of loving you. A university student, a young merchant, a kind man with empty pockets. The choice wasn't between staying single or getting married. It was between professional survival and romantic destruction, between a life of comfort and artistry, or a life of genuine love lived in poverty. Most chose survival. The debt followed you like a shadow. 5 years old when you entered the okiya. 6 years of basic training, food, shelter, clothing, lessons in dance, shamisen, tea ceremony. By your debut, you already owed thousands. Each beautiful kimono added to the total, each meal, each day of instruction. The numbers grew faster than most women could ever repay them. Marriage meant facing that entire sum at once. But the financial burden wasn't the cruelest part. Marriage meant leaving your sisters, the only family you'd ever really known, the community that understood your struggles, celebrated your successes, held you through disappointments. These women had suffered the same losses, mastered the same impossible skills. Outside the okiya walls, you would be utterly alone, a former geisha in a world that had no place for what you used to be. In 1911, Ikimaru was the most celebrated geisha in all of Kyoto. Crowds gathered just to hear her play shamisen. She could have had any danna she wanted, wealthy men who would pay her debts and keep her in luxury. Instead, she fell in love with a university student named Kenji. He had nothing but sincerity and dreams. Their secret letters, discovered decades later, reveal plans that never came to pass. Kenji wrote to Ichimaru, "I know I cannot give you silk or servants or the respect that comes with success, but I can give you something you've never had, the freedom to be loved for who you are beneath all the beauty they've trained into you." She kept that letter until the day she died. 50 years later, still unmarried, still a geisha, still wondering what if. Marriage meant more than leaving the profession. It meant becoming legally invisible. A wife belonged to her husband's family. Her achievements, her skills, her identity, all of it dissolved into his surname. After decades of being celebrated, consulted, courted by powerful men, she would become just another wife. Anonymous, expected to bow to a mother-in-law who had never mastered a single art form. The transformation was complete erasure. Your hands remember decades of shamisen strings. Your body holds 20 years of precise dance movements. Your mind contains thousands of poems, songs, stories that made powerful men weep. But marriage required you to forget all of it, to pretend those skills didn't exist, to serve tea instead of performing tea ceremony. The difference sounds small, but it contained entire worlds of meaning. Everything you were became everything you couldn't be. The okiya owners understood human nature perfectly. They knew that love would eventually come knocking, so they made the price of leaving impossibly high. Not just the debt, but immediate payment, with interest calculated to the day. Some women tried to negotiate. Could they pay in installments, continue performing until the debt was cleared? The answer was always no. Marriage meant complete severance. No middle ground existed. Masuda Sayo wrote about watching her closest friend, Hanako, receive a marriage proposal from a man she genuinely loved. They spent 3 days calculating, selling everything she owned, borrowing from every contact. Still not enough. Not even close. Hanako wept for exactly 1 night. The next morning she painted her face, dressed in her finest kimono, and told her lover she could never see him again. She lived 30 more years as a geisha, never spoke his name again. A precious few managed to escape, usually older geishas whose debts were finally paid, whose beauty was fading, whose earning potential was declining. They married shopkeepers, farmers, men who understood they were getting someone extraordinary. But even then, the transition was brutal. Hands accustomed to silk had to learn to scrub floors. Voices trained for entertainment had to quiet themselves. The lucky ones found husbands who treasured their former skills privately. The cruelest irony? Many geishas did experience genuine love with their danna. These relationships could last decades. Deep affection, respect, even tenderness. But it remained forever unequal. He had a legal wife at home. She had a profession to maintain. The love existed in borrowed moments, in letters signed with pet names, in gifts that acknowledged what could never be publicly claimed, beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. So most geishas chose their art over love. Not because they were cold or calculating, but because they understood the mathematics of survival. They'd sacrificed their childhoods to become extraordinary. Why sacrifice their adulthood to become ordinary? In the floating world of the pleasure districts, they were artists, entrepreneurs, celebrities. In marriage, they would be invisible. The choice, when seen clearly, wasn't really a choice at all. The system was designed perfectly to prevent exactly what it seemed to promise. The possibility of love made the life bearable, while the impossibility of love made the system profitable. Every geisha knew that somewhere out there, genuine affection waited, but the price of claiming it was designed to be too high. The hope kept them going. The reality kept them working, brilliant in its cruelty. By the 1920s, everything was changing. Modern women were choosing careers, demanding independence, refusing arranged marriages. But for geishas, modernity felt like mockery. They'd been independent for centuries, at the cost of ever being truly free. As you drift off tonight, consider this. Sometimes the most liberated people are also the most trapped. Their freedom was real, their prison was golden, both things were true at once. Chapter 9. Love and Loss. Behind the painted faces and silk kimonos lived women with beating hearts, capable of falling deeply, desperately in love. But in the floating world of geishas, love came with a price tag few could afford. Tonight, we explore the bittersweet reality of women who had to choose between professional survival and the kind of love that makes your chest ache with longing. Imagine being 22 years old, your shamisen skills finally perfected, your conversation polished like a pearl. You've spent 16 years learning to be the perfect companion. Then across a crowded tea house you meet someone who sees past the performance, straight to the girl you were before the white makeup. Someone who makes you forget, for dangerous moments, that love is a luxury you can't afford. In spring of 1895, a Kyoto geisha named Yukiko fell in love with a poetry teacher. He had gentle hands and quoted basho while walking through temple gardens. But he earned 12 yen monthly. Her kimono cost 40. She owed her okiya 3,000. The mathematics of love don't care about poetry or gentle hands, or the way someone's laugh makes you feel like you're finally home. Every debt was recorded in careful brushstrokes, shamisen lessons, silk thread repairs, rice down to individual grains. The okiya mama-san kept ledgers thick as dictionaries, tracking every sen spent on making these girls into living art. Freedom meant paying back everything, including interest that seemed to multiply like spring cherry blossoms. Beautiful, but overwhelming in their abundance, love letters had to be hidden like state secrets, written on rice paper thin enough to dissolve in tea if discovered. Tucked inside shamisen cases, sewn into obi linings, pressed between pages of poetry books, young geishas developed elaborate codes, flower arrangements that meant meet me at midnight, tea ceremony gestures that whispered, I dream of you, romance conducted entirely in shadows and symbols. The cruelest irony, Jarafias were trained to be perfect companions, skilled at making men feel understood and desired. They knew exactly how to laugh at jokes, pour sake with grace, discuss literature with intelligence. Then they met someone who stirred genuine feelings, and discovered all those perfect skills meant nothing when your heart was breaking for someone you couldn't have. In summer of 1908, three geishas from the same okiya fell in love with poor men: a carpenter, a bookshop clerk, a temple gardener. They met in secret, sharing dreams of simple lives, cooking rice in tiny apartments, hanging laundry on bamboo poles, sleeping past dawn without painted faces. All three ultimately chose their profession. Love faded, survival endured, the ledgers never lied, some tried running away. Historical records from police stations tell stories of geishas found at train stations, clutching small bundles of belongings and love letters. They were always returned to their okiyas. The debt followed them like a persistent shadow. You couldn't outrun what you owed. Freedom wasn't something you stole, it was something you bought, coin by painful coin. The wealthy patrons, the danna, weren't always villains. Many formed genuine affections with their geishas, but they understood the arrangement. She provided companionship and beauty. He provided financial security. Love, if it bloomed, was a bonus. Marriage was never discussed. He had a wife at home. She had debts to pay. Affection within boundaries, carefully measured and maintained. Picture autumn evenings when geishas walked home alone after entertaining, passing young couples holding hands openly, family shops with children's laughter spilling into streets. The contrast must have felt sharp as a blade, watching the simple intimacy they'd traded for silk kimonos and artistic recognition, beauty and loneliness, walking hand in hand through empty streets toward empty rooms. Letters survive in museum archives, ink faded but emotions still vivid. My beloved teacher, I practice your favorite song each morning, pretending you can hear. The mama-san speaks of a new patron. I must smile and pour his tea while my heart lives in yesterday's garden with you. Signed with a thumbprint in place of her Geisha name, reclaiming her identity for one private moment. Age brought different sorrows. Older geishas watched their beauty fade, their value decrease. Some finally paid their debts by 40, only to discover that decades of professional entertainment had left them isolated from normal romantic connections. They knew how to please men for money. They'd forgotten how to simply love someone who loved them back, without transaction or performance required. The rare few who chose love over survival faced brutal consequences. Cast out from the only world they knew, skills worthless outside pleasure districts. Former geishas became seamstresses, maids, shop clerks, anonymous women who once commanded rooms with their presence. Love, it turned out, didn't pay rent or buy rice. Passion couldn't fill empty stomachs or mend worn shoes. Yet some stories carried whispers of happiness. A Meiji-era geisha who saved every coin for 20 years, finally buying her freedom at 38. She married her childhood friend, a farmer who waited. They grew vegetables and raised 3 children. She never performed again, never wore silk kimonos, but neighbors said her laughter sounded like music floating across rice fields. The floating world demanded its tributes in human hearts. For every geisha who achieved financial independence, dozens remained trapped between duty and desire. They mastered every art except the most important one. Loving freely, their sacrifices preserved a cultural tradition while breaking individual spirits, beauty and tragedy, inseparable as shadow and light in paper lantern districts. As you drift towards sleep, remember these women who chose survival over sentiment, not from coldness, but from understanding exactly what the world demanded. They loved deeply, quietly, in stolen moments between performances. Perhaps the truest romance lives not in fairy tale endings, but in hearts brave enough to feel everything, even when feeling costs more than they can afford to pay. Chapter 10: Love in the Shadows. Behind the painted smiles and perfect bows, something unexpected bloomed: real affection. Not the practiced charm geishas displayed for every client, but genuine tenderness that grew between women and their danna over months, years, sometimes decades. These weren't fairy tale romances. They were complex relationships where money and emotion intertwined in ways that defied simple understanding. Ikamame was 19 when she met Takeshi. He became her danna in 1897, paying her substantial debts to the okiya in exchange for exclusive companionship. What began as pure transactions slowly transformed. His letters, discovered in a Kyoto archive, reveal pet names, inside jokes, genuine concern when she fell ill with pneumonia. She kept everyone in a lacquered box. Their relationship lasted 23 years. 23 years of stolen moments between his business obligations and her evening appointments. He brought her books she mentioned wanting to read. She learned his favorite shamisen melodies, When his legal wife gave birth, Ikimame sent congratulations. When Ikimame miscarried their child, he held her as she wept. Complex doesn't begin to cover it. The children born from these relationships lived in a strange twilight, acknowledged but not legitimate, loved but not claimed. Masako, daughter of the Geisha Kikuyu and her danna, grew up visiting her father's grand house but never living there. She called her mother's patron uncle in public, papa in whispers. Love existed, but it wore masks. Some geishas found themselves genuinely attracted to their danna's minds. Wealthy patrons weren't just businessmen. They were often cultured, educated, worldly. Conversations flowed as naturally as Seika. Kiharu wrote to her sister about her danna's knowledge of Western philosophy, how he could discuss Kant as easily as haiku. Intellectual compatibility bred emotional intimacy. Neither expected, but love in this world came with impossible rules. A danna could visit whenever he pleased. A geisha could never show up unannounced at his home. He had a wife who bore his legitimate heirs. She had a career that required charming other men. Jealousy was forbidden. Officially, the private letters tell different stories of longing and heartbreak. Yuki fell in love with her danna after 3 years together. Real love, the kind that made her stomach flutter when he arrived for their weekly meetings. She began refusing other clients' advances more frequently. He noticed, started visiting twice weekly instead of once. Neither spoke the word love aloud. That would change everything and destroy everything. The most successful relationships acknowledged their limitations. Mutual respect flourished where romantic expectations might have withered. Tomo and her danna developed rituals, specific tea they shared, books they read together, private jokes about other patrons. They created intimacy within boundaries, affection that didn't demand transformation. Sometimes constraint breeds deeper connection than freedom. When Hiroshi's wife died in 1904, he offered to marry Sayuri after 7 years as her danna. She considered it for exactly 1 night. Marriage meant leaving the okiya, abandoning her artistic training, losing the only identity she'd ever known. She chose her profession over love. He understood. Their relationship continued unchanged for 15 more years. Age brought different challenges to these relationships. Older geishas watched younger ones capture their danna's attention, but established emotional bonds often proved stronger than physical attraction. Michiko, 52, had been with the same patron for 18 years when he began visiting a 20-year-old. He returned to Michiko within months, confessing he missed their conversations. Some danna grew genuinely protective of their geisha's well-being beyond the contractual obligations. When Fumiko's okiya forced her to entertain particularly violent clients, her danna intervened, not because it affected him, but because he cared about her safety. This kind of advocacy blurred the lines between transaction and genuine partnership in ways neither anticipated. The gifts told stories of deepening affection. Early in relationships, danna gave expensive but impersonal items: silk, jewelry, perfume. As emotional connections developed, gifts became intimate. A favorite author's rare manuscript, medicine when she was ill, books of poetry with passages underlined, small objects that said, "I know you," rather than "I possess you." Seasonal separations tested these bonds. Many wealthy patrons traveled extensively for business, leaving their geishas for months at a time. Letters flew back and forth, expressing loneliness neither could admit face to face. "The cherry blossoms bloomed early this year," wrote one geisha. "I wished you were here to see them with me." Vulnerability expressed in careful poetry. Death brought the strangest revelations. When patrons died, some left substantial inheritances to their geishas, not from obligation but from love. Others' families contested these bequests, refusing to acknowledge relationships that had lasted decades. Legal battles revealed the depth of emotional connections that society preferred to ignore. Love leaves evidence, even when hidden. The most poignant stories come from geishas' memoirs, written decades later. They remember not the expensive gifts or glamorous parties, but quiet moments, hands held during thunderstorms, shared laughter over silly mistakes, the way their danna's eyes softened when no one else was watching. These women understood that love doesn't always require possession to be real. Perhaps there's wisdom in these shadow relationships, love that exists without demanding complete transformation, affection that flourishes within boundaries rather than despite them. These geishas and their patrons created intimacy in impossible circumstances, proving that human connection finds ways to bloom even in the most constrained gardens. Sometimes the heart chooses its own path. Chapter 11. The trapped geisha. Picture this: a woman who's mastered the shamisen until her fingers move like water across silk strings. She spent 20 years perfecting her art, building her reputation. Now imagine telling her she can never abandon this identity, not even for love. This is the world of the geisha. Tonight we're exploring why these women lived in a beautiful prison of their own making, where career and heart could never truly coexist. First, let's clear something up. When most people think of Japan's pleasure districts, they imagine one type of woman. But there were actually two distinct paths, and understanding the difference changes everything. On one side you had the oran, high-ranking courtesans who could be ransomed through marriage. Their virginity was literally sold to the highest bidder. But afterward, escape was possible. They could become wives, mothers, ordinary women. The geisha path was entirely different. A geisha's identity wasn't something she wore like a costume she could remove at day's end. It was carved into her bones through years of training that began in childhood. From the moment she entered the okiya as a young girl, every lesson in dance, every note on the shamisen, every perfectly poured cup of tea became part of who she was. This wasn't just a job, it was a complete transformation of self, one that couldn't be undone. The financial reality was brutal. Every kimono, every grain of rice, every minute of instruction was meticulously recorded as debt. A geisha didn't just owe money, she owed her entire existence to the okiya. These debts often took decades to repay, and here's the catch: if she married, the debt didn't disappear. It became immediately due, in full. Most geishas could never afford to buy their freedom, even after years of success. Marriage wasn't just financially impossible for most geishas, it was professionally devastating. The moment she spoke wedding vows, she ceased to exist as a geisha. All those years of training, her entire artistic identity, the only community she'd ever known, gone. She couldn't be a part-time geisha or a retired geisha who occasionally performed. The system demanded complete dedication. Marriage meant choosing poverty and anonymity after a lifetime of art and recognition. But here's what made the geisha system truly unique in Japanese society: body autonomy. Unlike Owara, geishas chose their own intimate partners. They couldn't be forced into physical relationships. They had genuine control over their sexuality. This was revolutionary in a society where women had virtually no say over their bodies. But this freedom came with the steepest price imaginable. They could never fully belong to anyone, including themselves. The danna system complicated everything. These wealthy patrons would pay a geisha's debts in exchange for exclusive access to her company and intimacy. But this wasn't marriage, it was a business arrangement, where both parties understood the rules. The danna usually had a legal wife at home. The geisha maintained her career and independence. When genuine feelings developed, as they sometimes did, it made everything more painful rather than more beautiful. In 1911, a Kyoto geisha named Ikimaru fell deeply in love with a university student. Their secret letters, discovered decades later, revealed desperate plans to elope. She never did. He couldn't afford to be her danna, and she couldn't afford to marry him. The financial mathematics of love were impossible. She chose her art, her debts, her identity over her heart. This story repeated itself countless times across Japan's flower and willow world. What's rarely discussed is how some geishas found genuine affection with their danna. These relationships could span decades, intimate letters filled with pet names and tender concerns for each other's health. But even when deep love existed, equality never could. She was his secret, he was her patron. When one danna suggested marriage after his wife's death, the geisha declined. At 43, finally debt-free, marriage would mean losing everything she'd worked for. The geisha world created a peculiar form of female independence that came at an enormous cost. These women could own property, refuse clients, build personal wealth, freedoms almost no other Japanese women possessed. But they could never have conventional families. They could never wake up next to the same person every morning. They traded the possibility of ordinary love for extraordinary autonomy, and once that choice was made, there was no going back. Their trapped existence wasn't just about money or social conventions. It was about identity itself. After decades of perfecting an art form, of being celebrated for skills that took a lifetime to master, how do you simply stop? How do you become nobody after being somebody so completely? For many geishas, the thought of abandoning their craft was more terrifying than never finding conventional love. The seasonal rhythms of geisha life reinforced this trap. Spring meant cherry blossom viewings, where her shamisen playing would bring tears to clients' eyes. Summer festivals required specific dances passed down through generations. Winter meant intimate tea ceremonies in snow-covered tea houses. Each season demanded her presence, her skills, her complete attention. There was no pause in the calendar where she could step away and still remain a geisha. The most poignant aspect of geisha love stories isn't their tragedy, it's their impossible beauty. When love appeared, it bloomed in stolen moments between performances. A glance across a crowded tea house, a letter hidden in the folds of a kimono. These relationships existed in the margins of their professional lives, treasured precisely because they couldn't be possessed or displayed. Love became more precious because it couldn't be lived fully. Some Western romanticization of geisha life misses this central truth. These weren't women waiting to be rescued by love. They were professionals who understood exactly what they were trading. They chose art over convention, independence over security, mastery over marriage. When they felt genuine affection, they protected it by keeping it separate from their public lives. They understood that some forms of love exist best when they don't demand total transformation. By the 1920s, as Japan modernized, some geishas began questioning this system. A few managed to marry after fully paying their debts, but they discovered that leaving the flower and willow world meant entering a society that didn't know how to receive them. They were too independent for conventional marriage, too associated with pleasure districts for respectable society. They'd traded one trap for another. The Geisha system reveals something profound about human choices. These women achieved a rare autonomy for their time, but autonomy always comes at a price. They could control their art, their bodies, their earnings. They just couldn't control their hearts without losing everything else. As you fall asleep tonight, consider how much we still struggle with these same impossible questions about love, career, and identity. Chapter 12. The reality behind Western perceptions. Everything Hollywood taught you about geishas is wrong. These weren't delicate flowers waiting for romance. They were shrewd businesswomen, navigating one of history's most brutal economic systems. The Western imagination painted them as courtesans selling love to wealthy men. The truth? They were artists whose survival depended on intelligence, not sentiment. Tonight we crack open the myth. Western films love the image, a geisha falling in love with her wealthy patron, abandoning her profession for true love. It's beautiful fiction. The reality was far harsher. Every grain of rice, every silk thread, every music lesson was recorded as debt. A geisha didn't serve romance. She performed a carefully calculated dance between artistry and survival. Love was a luxury most couldn't afford. Picture this. A 5-year-old girl sold to an okiya, spending the next 15 years learning shamisen, dance, poetry, conversation. By her debut, she owed thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. Every beautiful kimono, every lesson, every meal had been meticulously tallied. She wasn't training to find love, she was accumulating a debt that would define every relationship for decades. The danna system reveals the economic truth. Wealthy patrons didn't court geishas, they invested in them. A danna paid her debts in exchange for exclusive access to her company, her art, her intimacy. But this wasn't romance, it was a business arrangement both parties understood completely. She provided entertainment and companionship, he provided financial security. Marriage was never part of the equation. Here's what the movies never show. When a geisha married, her career ended instantly. Not gradually, not romantically, immediately. She had to abandon years of training, her artistic identity, the only community she'd ever known. Worse, if her debts weren't fully settled, the okiya demanded immediate payment. Most geishas simply couldn't afford to fall in love with poor men. The archives hold heartbreaking stories. Ikimaru, a renowned Kyoto geisha in 1911, fell in love with a university student. Their secret letters revealed desperate plans to run away together. She never did. The financial burden was insurmountable. Another geisha, Masuda Sayo, wrote about watching peers choose wealthy danna over poor lovers repeatedly, not from greed, but from necessity. But genuine affection did exist, just not where Western imagination places it. Some geishas developed deep emotional bonds with their danna. Letters between the geisha Kiharu and her patron from the 1890s show real tenderness, pet names, genuine concern for each other's well-being. These relationships could span decades, but they remained fundamentally unequal. He had a wife at home, the cruelest irony. When Kiharu's danna suggested marriage after his wife's death, she declined. She was 43, her debts finally paid. Marriage would mean poverty after a lifetime of luxury. She had achieved something rare for Japanese women, economic independence. Love simply wasn't worth returning to dependence. This was the impossible choice geishas faced daily. Western narratives confused geishas with oiranen, high-ranking courtesans who could be ransomed through marriage. Geishas operated differently. They chose their own sexual partners, maintained autonomy over their bodies, could refuse clients. This independence came at a price. While an oiran might escape through marriage, a geisha's very identity was her career. To marry meant ceasing to exist professionally. Their intelligence was their greatest asset. Jay has memorized hundreds of songs, mastered complex dances, navigated political conversations, managed wealthy egos. They weren't passive entertainment. They were active participants in Japan's cultural and political life. Many became confidantes to powerful men, influencing decisions through carefully chosen words. Their minds, not their beauty, ensured survival in this harsh system. The artistry was survival strategy. Every gesture, every glance, every pause in conversation was calculated. They studied their clients like scholars, learning preferences, fears, desires. A successful geisha could read a room instantly, adapt her personality to complement whoever needed entertaining. This wasn't deception, it was professional mastery, refined over decades of observation and practice. Love, when it appeared, was bittersweet. Recognized but impossible to fully embrace without devastating consequences. Some geishas kept secret lovers, men they met in stolen moments between appointments. These relationships existed in shadows, treasured precisely because they couldn't be possessed. The heart wants what it wants, but the ledger books demanded payment first. The Western myth of romantic rescue misses the point entirely. These weren't tragic figures waiting for salvation through love. They were professionals who understood exactly what they were trading. And often, romantic love wasn't worth the price of poverty. They had achieved rare autonomy for women in feudal Japan, owning property, building wealth, controlling their own destinies. Their legacy challenges our assumptions about love versus independence. The geisha system created an impossible bind. Professional success required sacrificing conventional romantic structures. Sound familiar? Even today, women navigate similar tensions between career ambition and traditional relationship expectations. The geishas simply made their choices more deliberately, with fuller understanding of the consequences involved. Perhaps there's wisdom in their approach, recognizing that some forms of love exist best when they don't demand total transformation. The geishas understood that genuine affection could bloom in margins, treasured precisely because it couldn't be possessed completely. They chose art over convention, independence over dependence, professional identity over romantic fantasy. The next time you see a geisha in popular culture, remember, these were working women using intelligence and artistry to survive brutal economic systems. When love appeared, it was often bittersweet, acknowledged but impossible to pursue without destroying everything they'd built. Their reality was far more complex and far more admirable than Western romance ever imagined. Chapter 13. The Bittersweet Freedom. Picture a world where women could own property, refuse clients and build wealth, yet couldn't marry for love without losing everything. This was the paradox of the geisha system, a delicate balance between unprecedented freedom and invisible chains. Tonight we explore how these remarkable women navigated between autonomy and isolation, creating lives of beauty within structures designed to keep them forever apart from conventional happiness. In the floating world of Edo, Japan, geishas occupied a space that defied easy categorization. They weren't wives bound to husbands' whims. They weren't courtesans selling intimacy to survive. They were artists, professionals, women who had carved out something entirely their own. Yet this independence came with a price that few outsiders understood. The very freedom that elevated them above other women also isolated them from the romantic structures that defined feminine success. The financial reality was stark and unforgiving. Every silk thread in their kimonos, every shamisen lesson, every grain of rice was recorded in the okiyas ledgers. A geisha might earn tremendous sums, enough to purchase her own property, hire servants, commission art, but the debt to her house remained, sometimes for decades. This wasn't exploitation, it was a complex investment system that gave women economic power at the cost of romantic freedom. Marriage meant professional death. Not metaphorically, literally. The moment a geisha married, she ceased to exist in the flower and willow world. Her years of training, her carefully cultivated relationships, her artistic identity, all of it would vanish. She'd become just another wife, dependent on her husband's income, stripped of the autonomy she'd spent years building. For many, this wasn't a sacrifice they could make, even for love. The danna system created its own form of love, complex and carefully bounded. These wealthy patrons weren't just clients, they were protectors, benefactors, sometimes genuine companions. A danna might support a geisha for decades, know her thoughts, share her bed, even father her children, yet he remained married to another woman, and she remained professionally committed to her art. It was intimacy within limits, affection with understood boundaries. Some geishas found themselves caught between two worlds when unexpected love arrived. Historical records tell of secret letters, clandestine meetings, hearts pulled toward men who could never afford to be their patrons. These love affairs bloomed in shadows, beautiful and impossible. The choice was always the same: pursue love and face poverty, or maintain prosperity and abandon the heart. Most chose survival over romance. The autonomy geishas enjoyed was remarkable for its time. They could refuse clients who displeased them, something unthinkable for most women in feudal Japan. They chose their own sexual partners, controlled their earnings, made business decisions. This power came from their artistic skills, their ability to entertain, to make themselves indispensable. Yet this very indispensability trapped them within the system that granted them freedom. The geisha houses themselves understood this tension. An okiya invested years and fortunes in training their girls, knowing that marriage would mean losing that investment entirely. So they created a world so complete, so fulfilling in its own way, that leaving felt like abandoning paradise for the uncertain world beyond. The house became family. The other geishas became sisters. The profession became identity itself. Cultural significance rippled outward from these elegant districts. The aesthetic of restraint, the beauty of things that couldn't be possessed, the art of conversation without commitment, these concepts shaped Japanese culture far beyond the pleasure quarters. Geishas became symbols of sophisticated femininity, precisely because they remained just out of reach, beautiful and untouchable, professional and personal simultaneously. The distinction mattered deeply. Unlike Oren, who might be ransomed into marriage, Geishas had chosen a path that made marriage almost impossible. Their training was too extensive, their debts too large, their professional identity too complete. They had traded the possibility of conventional love for a different kind of power, the ability to survive independently in a world designed to make women dependent. Some found contentment in this arrangement. They aged gracefully within the system, becoming okasan, mother figures who ran houses and guided younger women. They accumulated wealth, property, respect. Their relationships with danna deepened over decades into something resembling marriage without its legal constraints. They created families of choice, bonds stronger than blood, communities that sustained them through every season of life. Others struggled against the invisible walls. Letters survive from geishas who dreamed of different lives, who watched ordinary women with their husbands and children, and felt something ache inside. They had gained so much education, financial independence, artistic mastery, social status, yet they'd lost something too: the simple possibility of being loved without conditions, without the weight of professional obligation shadowing every intimate moment. The impact extended beyond individual lives to shape entire cultural movements. The concept of mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, was embodied in these women who lived between worlds. They inspired literature, influenced fashion, defined elegance itself. Their very existence challenged assumptions about femininity, showing that women could be both powerful and beautiful, independent yet yearning for connection. As Japan modernized, the geisha system faced new pressures. Young women had other options: education, careers, the possibility of choosing both love and independence. Yet the flower and willow world persisted, adapting while maintaining its essential character. Some geishas did eventually marry, though often only after paying their debts and earning their freedom through years of dedication to their craft. The bittersweet freedom they embodied speaks to timeless tensions. How do we balance professional identity with personal relationships? Can independence and intimacy coexist? Their lives suggest that perhaps some forms of love are most precious, precisely because they cannot be possessed completely. Beauty exists in the space between having and wanting, between freedom and commitment, between the professional self and the private heart. Their legacy reminds us that freedom always comes with prices we don't expect to pay. The geisha chose artistic mastery and financial independence, accepting that conventional love might remain forever just beyond reach. In their world, the most profound relationships bloomed in the margins, treasured not, despite their limitations, but because of them. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the smallest spaces between what's possible and what's forbidden. Chapter 14. The Chronicle of Influence. Beyond the silken ceremony, geishas left fingerprints on the soul of Japanese culture that remain visible centuries later. Their influence seeped into literature, philosophy, and the very way Japan understands beauty itself. Tonight we explore how these women, artists who chose their craft over convention, shaped aesthetic principles that still guide Japanese design, literature, and thought. Their legacy runs deeper than most people realize. The concept of iki, this word appears constantly in discussions of Japanese aesthetics, yet few understand its geisha origins. Iki means sophisticated restraint, not simplicity, but complexity held in perfect balance. A geisha embodied iki in how she moved through a room, present but not demanding attention, elegant but never ostentatious. She understood that true sophistication whispers rather than shouts. This principle would revolutionize Japanese artistic expression. Watch a master geisha pour tea, and you witness iki in motion, every gesture deliberate, yet effortless. The angle of her wrist as she lifts the pot, the precise moment she pauses before speaking, the way her kimono sleeve creates a perfect curve without seeming calculated. This wasn't performance, it was philosophy, made physical, restraint as the highest form of artistry, control so complete it appears natural. Then there's mono, aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence that geishas understood better than anyone. Cherry blossoms bloom for just days, their beauty intensified by its brevity. Geishas lived this principle. Their youth, their beauty, their very careers were temporary, and they found profound meaning in that transience. Beauty becomes more precious when you know it won't last forever. A geisha's career was mono-no-aware, embodied. She spent decades perfecting arts she could practice for perhaps 20 years. Each performance was unrepeatable, each conversation unique and lost to time. This awareness of impermanence infused everything she did with heightened significance. Western culture fights against aging and change. Japanese aesthetics, influenced by Geisha philosophy, found beauty in accepting the temporary nature of all things. Literary Japan fell under this spell completely. The floating world novels of the Edo period drew directly from geisha districts. Writers like Ihara Saikaku captured not just their stories but their philosophical approach to life. The geisha became literature's perfect metaphor, beauty existing in the margins of society, sophisticated yet accessible, permanent in memory but fleeting in reality. Kawabata, Yasunari's Snow Country, his Nobel Prize-winning meditation on loneliness and beauty, centers on a geisha. The novel's famous opening, the train came out of the long tunnel into the snow country, leads us directly to Kamako, a geisha whose very existence embodies the novel's themes. Transience, isolation, beauty that hurts precisely because it cannot last. Pure geisha philosophy translated into prose. Visual arts absorbed geisha aesthetics like ink in paper, the subtle color palettes of traditional Japanese painting, those muted grays and soft browns that suggest rather than declare, echo the geisha preference for understated elegance. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints captured geisha subjects precisely because they represented this floating world philosophy. Art as ephemeral beauty, preserved only in memory and image. The tea ceremony transformed under geisha influence. What began as rigid Buddhist ritual became more fluid, more intuitive. Geishas understood that perfection lies not in following rules exactly, but in making those rules appear effortless. Tea masters began incorporating this principle. The highest technique is no visible technique. Ceremony became conversation, structure became dance, religion became art. Japanese garden design still reflects geisha sensibilities. The principle of controlled revelation, how a path curves to hide then reveal a stone lantern, how water appears then disappears behind rocks, mirrors how geishas moved through conversation, never showing everything at once, always suggesting more than they revealed. Gardens became three-dimensional expressions of geisha interaction philosophy. Kimono design evolved entirely around geisha taste. Before geishas, Japanese clothing followed court traditions, heavy, formal, status-announcing. Geishas needed clothing that moved with their bodies, that suggested sophistication without screaming wealth. They pioneered the art of subtle luxury. A kimono's true beauty lay in details only the wearer and her intimate companions would notice. Hidden elegance. Modern Japanese design carries geisha DNA in its appreciation for negative space, its preference for implication over statement. The clean lines of contemporary Japanese architecture, the way a room feels complete with just a few perfectly chosen objects, these principles trace back to geisha aesthetics. Apple's design philosophy owes more to geisha tea houses than most people realize. But geishas represented something larger, a recurring pattern in human history. Women choosing art over convention, Sappho writing poetry instead of weaving, medieval illuminators signing their manuscripts, Renaissance painters opening studios. These women understood that true fulfillment sometimes requires abandoning society's expectations. Geishas were part of this ancient sisterhood of artistic rebels who prioritized creation over conformity. Consider the French salonières, women like Madame de Staël, who chose intellectual discourse over domestic duty, or the Harlem Renaissance women who turned their homes into centers of artistic revolution. Like geishas, they created alternative spaces where their talents could flourish. They understood that sometimes choosing art means choosing a life that looks unconventional from the outside, but feels completely authentic within. This pattern reveals something profound about human nature. Throughout history, certain women have been willing to trade conventional security for artistic freedom. They've created parallel societies where different values could flourish. Geishas were part of this tradition, building a world where skill mattered more than status, where intelligence was valued, where women could control their own economic destiny through art. Their influence continues rippling outward in every Japanese novel that finds beauty in impermanence, in every garden that reveals its secrets slowly, in every tea ceremony that prizes intuition over instruction. Geishas proved that choosing art over convention isn't just rebellion, it's a form of cultural leadership. They shaped Japan's aesthetic soul by refusing to let society limit their artistic possibilities. Some influences last centuries. Chapter 15. Reflections on Geisha's Dilemmas. Here we are, at the end of our journey through the floating world. After everything we've explored together, the economics, the relationships, the impossible choices, it's time to sit with what we've learned. Because the truth about geishas challenges everything our culture taught us about women, love, and sacrifice. These weren't tragic heroines waiting for rescue. They were professionals making calculated decisions about their own lives. Think about it. Every story you've heard about geishas probably painted them as victims. Beautiful, exotic women trapped in golden cages, longing for true love to set them free. But that narrative, it says more about us than them. It reveals our discomfort with women who choose career over conventional romance, who value their professional identity more than marriage, who see love as something precious precisely because it can't possess them completely. The geishas we've met in these stories, Ishimaru writing secret letters to her student lover, Kiharu declining marriage, even after decades with her danna, Masuda Sayo watching her sisters choose survival over sentiment. These women weren't deluded, they understood exactly what they were trading. Years of artistic training and financial security against the uncertain promise of romantic happiness. And often, they chose their art. There's something profound in that choice. In a world that told women their only value lay in serving men, geishas carved out space where they served beauty itself, where their intelligence, their artistry, their very presence became commodities they controlled. Yes, the system was brutal. Yes, they started as children sold into debt, but within those constraints, they found a kind of freedom most women couldn't even imagine. The question that haunts me, and maybe haunts you too, is whether their choices were truly free. How do you separate genuine preference from internalized necessity? When survival depends on maintaining professional distance from love, when does pragmatism become identity? The letters between geishas and their lovers suggest they felt the weight of this question too. Love existed, but always in the margins, always shadowed by economic reality. What strikes me most is how little has changed. Today's professional women still navigate versions of these same dilemmas. The executive who delays marriage for her career, the artist who chooses her craft over conventional stability, the academic who prioritizes research over family. Society still whispers that women who choose work over love are somehow incomplete, somehow tragic. The Geisha story reveals how old this judgment really is. But here's what I've come to believe. There's beauty in choosing yourself. In saying that your identity, your art, your professional self, matters enough to sacrifice for. The geishas who declined marriage weren't giving up love, they were refusing to give up themselves. And in a world that constantly asks women to shrink, to choose, to sacrifice their ambitions for others' comfort, that refusal feels almost revolutionary. The danna system shows us something else too. that love and transaction can coexist without destroying each other. Some of these relationships lasted decades, involved genuine affection, mutual respect, even tenderness, but both parties understood the boundaries. He had a wife, she had a career, their love existed within limits, and maybe that's what made it precious. Not everything that matters needs to consume everything else. I think about the Geisha who told her lover she'd rather have 20 years of seeing him twice a month than a lifetime of poverty together. Western minds hear that and think, how sad. But maybe she understood something we've forgotten. That love doesn't always mean possession. That caring for someone sometimes means protecting what you've built separately. That intimacy can exist without merger. The tragedy isn't that Geishas couldn't marry their lovers. The tragedy is that society created a system where professional identity and romantic love were mutually exclusive, where women had to choose between economic security and emotional fulfillment, where being valued for your mind and artistry meant sacrificing the possibility of being valued as a complete person. That system, and yet, within that flawed system, Geishas found ways to love. Secret letters, stolen moments, relationships that lasted lifetimes even without legal recognition. They loved on their own terms, within their own constraints. Maybe that's not tragic at all. Maybe it's human. Maybe it's what we all do. Find ways to care for each other within whatever limits our circumstances impose. The modern world still struggles with these questions. We've expanded women's options, but we haven't solved the fundamental tension between personal fulfillment and professional success, between individual identity and relationship demands, between what we want for ourselves and what others need from us. The Geisha's dilemma isn't historical curiosity, it's current reality dressed in different clothes. It's every woman who's ever felt torn between competing versions of herself. What I find hopeful is how many geishas seem to have made peace with their choices. Their memoirs don't read like stories of regret. They read like stories of women who understood their world and navigated it with intelligence and grace, who found beauty and meaning within constraints, who created art that outlasted their individual lives, who loved differently than society expected, but genuinely nonetheless. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about geishas at all. It's about how we tell women's stories, how quick we are to cast professional women as tragic figures, how uncomfortable we get when women prioritize their work over romantic relationships, how we assume that any woman who doesn't follow conventional paths must be suffering. Maybe some of them are just choosing differently. Maybe some of them know exactly what they want. As you lie there tonight, thinking about these women across centuries and cultures, consider this. Every choice involves sacrifice. Every life involves trade-offs. The Geishas chose art over conventional love, financial security over romantic uncertainty, professional identity over marital anonymity. Were they right? Were they wrong? Maybe those aren't the right questions. Maybe the right question is, did they choose consciously? Did they live deliberately? Did they create something beautiful with whatever freedom they had? I think they did. And in a world that constantly pressures women to apologize for their ambitions, to choose others over themselves, to sacrifice their identities for love, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. Sleep well, knowing that throughout history, women have found ways to be true to themselves, even when the world made it nearly impossible. Even when love meant choosing, they chose with eyes wide open.